Okay, so this is my husband, Peter. We're already having fun. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you, it should be just 5 more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes. And I'm on the last, let's see, which slide are we on? We are on slide 15 out of 18. So I'm going to take you through the whole process of goniometry. In application session, we'll talk about how to do it and where to place the goniometer on for each joint and each movement. But first, let me just show you, a goniometer has 3 parts. It has an axis that the arms turn around, and it has 2 arms. The one with the large circle, in this one, the large one, it has the numbers or the protractor, is the stationary or the proximal arm. And it lines up with the proximal limb or bone, which is typically the bone that doesn't move, therefore the stationary bone. This arm is the movable or distal arm, and it moves with the limb. So if I'm doing elbow extension, this arm, the stationary or proximal arm, you can relax your arm, relax, lines up with the humerus, and the movable arm moves with the distal radius of the forearm. Okay, I just want to show you on the little one, well, the same thing actually on these, but it's not always the same. But the proximal arm is always the arm, I'm wrong, is always the arm with the protractor. The movable arm is just the arm. So here's the movable arm and the proximal or stationary arm. Okay, I'm going to show you the process doing elbow flexion, just because it's the easiest to show you. First, you want to make sure, I'm going to go along the principles, that the person's comfortable, that they're sitting supported. He's sitting up, back, feet on the ground, up against the chair. I'm going to explain in lay terminology what I'm going to do. So I'm going to say, hi Peter.
Hi.
I'm going to measure how much you can move this arm, bringing this hand, this is the motion I'm going to look at to see if you can do. So I'm going to see how much you can move from your hand up to your shoulder, and I'm going to measure the angle. I'm going to use a tool called a goniometer. Doesn't hurt. Just going to put it next to your arm, and it just measures the angle of movement that you have. Before I then do anything else with the goniometer, is I want to look at the joint. So I'm going to expose it. If he was wearing a long sleeve shirt, I would push it up. I'm looking at it. I want to see if there's any scarring around the elbow. If it's red, I'm going to touch it. Is it warm to the touch? Is it swollen? Do you have pain here when I touch it? Okay, great. So I checked it out. The arms, no scars, no swelling, no tenderness to touch. Then I'm going to see, before I do anything else with this arm, I'm going to say, what about this arm? Are you able to bring this hand up to your shoulder? No problem? Doesn't hurt? And can you straighten it out all the way? Great. So that's what I'm comparing it to. I know that his unaffected side, he can move no problems. Okay. Then I'm going to stabilize proximal, the joint proximal. So I want him to keep the arm at his side adducted. So I'm going to stabilize the glenohumeral joint at some level. It's much more important for manual muscle testing, but it's a good practice to get in and make sure he's moving just the elbow here. I'm going to have him start in the start position, which is 0. So I'm testing flexion, extension. I'm testing the full motion, which the norm is about 0 to 145, 0 to 155. So I want to start him at 0, if he can be. I'm going to ask him, so first, I asked to see how he moves this arm, no problem. Then again, before I take the goniometer, I want to see what you can do with this arm. Can you bring your hand, your palm, don't pretend you can't. Can you bring it all the way up to your shoulder? Well, wait, do a little less. And if he can do that, I'm going to say, let me see if I can push further. Because remember, I'm testing passive range of motion. So I have an idea, and when I do that, I don't just go, okay, let me see, because he could be like screaming in pain without saying it. So I'm going to see if you can bring your hand up here. I'm going to watch, and you can't do it all the way, but I'm going to see if I can go further, and I'm going to watch his face and say, you okay? Does it hurt?
It's fine.
Great. Okay. So now, to do that, I probably wouldn't be using a goniometer because he had full range, and I could estimate that by just looking at him. But we're going to pretend that he's from here, so you can't get down there, and you go up to there, okay? So you're there. So I'm going to pretend, so I have him in a start position, and I'm going to see if I can go further. Don't let me. You can't. So I can't get him to 0. So I'm going to start where my goniometer is. For the elbow, and for every joint it's different, the axis is lined, so the arms, let me back up. Elbow flexion is on the sagittal plane, so the arms of a goniometer are moving sagittally with the axis on a frontal plane. I line up the axle at the lateral epicondyle. I line up the stationary arm, or the proximal arm, with the humerus, or the stationary or proximal bone. And I hold it there, and I line up the movable or distal arm with the radius, okay? And I'm doing passive range, so I'm gonna see as much passive I can get him into extension. Typically this would be 0, but he has what appears to be a slight contraction, and I'm looking, and my start position is 37 degrees. Now I'm going to say, can you bring your hand up to your shoulder? And I'm going to make sure this is still lined up with the medial epicondyle, that my arms are still lined up. I'm going to push because I'm testing passive range of motion. And I have here 126. I'm then not going to let the arm just drop, because his arm might just drop, and I'm going to lower the arm, and you can relax. And his range of motion was, what did I say, 27 to 126 degrees of elbow flexion extension. Make sense? So, I was on, let's see if I did all this things according to this. I return limb size, start position, no degrees. I think I did everything accordingly. So I'm going to do one more motion before we start. I make sure you're comfortable. This time I'm going to use a little goniometer, and I'm going to do wrist. I'd rather do another one that's easier to see, so I think I'll do up here. No, bring your hand, Peter, to the table. Okay, so I'm going to, a little closer. Yeah, great. Okay. So I'm going to do wrist, ab, and adduction just to show you. So I'm making sure he's comfortable in a relaxed position. I explained to you what I'm going to do. As I did before, I'm going to see how the wrist moves in this direction. Okay? I'm looking at the wrist. First I'm going to have you turn it over, hand over. Is there any pain here? Anything? No. Turn it back. Great. And it's not red to the touch. I don't see any scars, not swollen, not painful. Then I'm going to see that hand. Can you, if I hold this here, can you bring your thumb towards me? Great. Can you go the other way? Great. So you have some movement there. So that's what I'm looking for here. Now, again, before I take the goniometer, and I might lift it off the table or put powder on the table because or something slippery, because sometimes the friction of the table can be a problem. So I'll keep your hand here, but I'm going to stabilize the proximal joint, or the joint here. I wouldn't use that terminology. I want you to bring your thumb that way as much as you can. Okay, let's try that again. Great. Instead of just bringing your thumb that way, bring your whole wrist towards me. Great. Notice that I gave not great directions. And can you bring your whole hand now towards me? Awesome. And relax. Okay. So now I'm on the next list of directions. So now I have the start position is with the wrist in neutral. My axis, so ab and adduction of the wrist, or ulnar and radial deviation, in an anatomical position are along the frontal plane. So my goniometer is along the frontal plane. In this position, it looks like it's the transverse plane. And then the axis is going through, so the axis is on the sagittal plane, or here it looks longitudinal. But I go down at the base of the metacarpal, Remember there's that divot, and that's where the capitate, the wrist bone is. I put the axis over the capitate. The proximal or stationary arm of the goniometer lines up with the middle of the forearm, so between the radius and the ulna. The distal, or the movable arm of the goniometer, lines up with the third metacarpal, not with the fingers and the phalanx. So sometimes someone will have some deviation, like they'll have arthritis, deviations of the fingers, and you're lining it up that way. Doesn't matter what the fingers are doing. You want to line this up, right, but you want to line this up with the metacarpal. Good. So let me make sure again, my axis is in the right place. Great. Now I'm going to have you do what I had you do before, so I'll test radial deviation, move it that way, awesome, and I'm going to move the movable arm, keeping it lined up or following the third metacarpal. I'm testing passive range of motion, so I want to see if I can go any further. I can. And that's 20 degrees. Okay, great. And now come back. Let's see. My start position is able to be in 0. So it was 0 to 20 degrees of radial deviation. And now come towards me. Great. And I'm going to see if I can go a little further. I can't. Great. And it's 0 to 25 degrees of ulnar deviation. And I put the arm back there. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So that's all I'm going to do now. We're going to review this again in application session this week, and we'll go through each joint, where the axis is, and how you measure it. Have a fun snow day. Thanks.